There is a sword that should not exist. It was forged more than 1,000 years ago in the heart of the Middle Ages. And when today's scientists placed it under the microscope, they were left without an answer. The metal was too pure for its time, too clean, too uniform. To make steel like this, you needed a level of heat that the Europe of that era simply did not know how to reach. A heat that would only exist again 800 years later during the Industrial Revolution. The question that opens this file is simple and unsettling. How did a blacksmith in the year 900 hold in his hands a technology from the future? In the age of the Vikings, between the years 800 and 1000, forging a sword was almost a gamble. The blacksmith heated the ore in a primitive furnace, and that furnace came nowhere near truly melting the iron. What remained was a spongy lump full of bubbles and residue trapped inside the metal. Archaeologists have a name for these impurities: slag, and slag is the nightmare of anyone forging a blade because it is a hidden line of weakness buried within the steel. In the middle of a battle, that is exactly where the sword bends or cracks. Most weapons of that era were like this, strong in appearance, fragile in the decisive moment. But scattered across Europe, a rare few blades began to appear that broke this rule. They cut better. They bent without breaking. They survived blows that shattered any other sword. For centuries, no one could explain why, until modern researchers decided to open one of them, cut into the metal, and look at its structure from the inside. What they found made no sense for the year that weapon had been forged. It was like finding a computer chip inside a medieval ruin. The person who led this investigation was a researcher named Alan Williams from a laboratory in London. He spent nearly 2 decades cutting, polishing, and analyzing dozens of these ancient blades. And what he measured was chilling. That steel had roughly 3 times more carbon than the common iron of the era. Carbon, in just the right amount, is what gives a blade its magic. It makes the metal hard enough to cut and flexible enough not to shatter. And there was another detail that was even stranger. Almost no slag at all. The metal was clean, uniform, nearly perfect. To grasp the true scale of this, you have to look at the timeline. Europe would not reach that level of purity in steel again until 800 years later. It happened during the Industrial Revolution, with furnaces driven by steam and coal on a massive scale. In other words, that sword was nearly 1,000 years ahead of its own time. And that is exactly what stopped the scientists cold inside the laboratory. How could a medieval craftsman with no thermometer, no industrial furnace, no modern chemistry, produce a metal so advanced? The answer was not in the blade itself. It was hidden in a single word engraved into the steel. All of these special blades carried the same word etched into the metal. Ulfberht, always with 2 small crosses, one before the name and one in the middle of it. It was not decoration. It was practically a brand, a seal of quality, a luxury label of the year 900. Anyone carrying a sword like this knew they held the finest steel the known world could offer. And like every valuable brand, it became the target of a problem very familiar to us: the copy. To this day, archaeologists have found around 170 blades with that name engraved on them. But when they began testing them one by one came the surprise. Many were fakes. Brand counterfeiting, more than 1,000 years ago, long before pirated goods existed at any street vendor's stand anywhere in the world. Someone in the Middle Ages was copying the name Ulfberht onto cheap steel to sell it at a high price. On the outside, the swords looked identical. On the inside, the fakes were still full of the old brittle slag, and there was an almost invisible way to tell the genuine ones from the copies. A tiny detail, one that was only noticed 1,000 years later. The difference lay in the exact placement of the crosses engraved into the metal. On the genuine swords, forged from pure steel, a cross appeared right after the name, in one precise spot. On the cheap imitations, the forgers got that position wrong. They copied the letters but never understood the code behind them. It was that flaw of mere millimeters that centuries later exposed the imposters, a mark of quality that only an insider knew how to read. And this completely changes the central question of this file. It is no longer just about how they made that steel, but where the raw material capable of producing such a metal came from. The secret of that metal has a name: crucible steel. Instead of hammering a spongy bloom the way they did in Europe, the technique was something else entirely. The iron was sealed inside a clay vessel, the crucible, along with just the right ingredients. And then everything was heated together until the metal truly melted and turned to liquid. When iron becomes liquid, the slag separates and rises to the surface. What remains below is clean, uniform steel, free of the impurities that weaken a blade. It is precisely this steel that left scientists absolutely stunned. This technique, however, faced a brutal obstacle. To melt iron, you have to reach nearly 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and the European forges of that era were nowhere close to that. The knowledge to reach and sustain such extreme heat simply did not exist in Europe. This crucible technology was not born there. It existed thousands of miles away, in another world. In the east, in the lands we now call Iran and Afghanistan. And this is where the story takes its most improbable turn, because we have a Viking sword found in the ice of the north, forged with a technology from the Middle East. To understand this encounter, we first need to dismantle a myth. When we think of Vikings, we picture the brutal raider storming a monastery on some frozen coastline. That image exists, but it tells only half the truth. The Vikings were not only warriors, they were also some of the greatest traders and navigators the world has ever seen. While some raided Europe from the west, others pushed east, along a route that almost no one talks about. They did not sail only across the open sea. They rode deep into the continents, up the great rivers, linking the frozen north to the heart of Asia. Descending along the rivers of what is now Russia, the Vikings built vast trade routes. Along the Volga River, they reached the Caspian Sea, and from there they connected to the great markets of the Islamic world. They traded with merchants who came from places as distant as Baghdad. They carried furs, amber, and slaves, and they brought back silver, silk, and ideas. Within this flow of goods, metals and forging techniques also traveled from lands where crucible steel was already known. The frozen north and the distant east were linked by a web of trade far larger than the classroom usually admits. And this isn't just an elegant theory, it left proof buried in the ground. In the Viking graves of Scandinavia, archaeologists have unearthed tens of thousands of Arab silver coins, money minted thousands of miles away in the heart of the Islamic world, resting in the pockets of northern warriors. Stop and think about that for a moment. A man buried in Sweden in the year 900 with his hands full of coins from the Middle East. If silver could make that entire journey to the northern ice, iron and steel could travel the very same road. Now it is worth understanding in simple terms the ingenuity behind that heat. To reach such a high temperature, lighting a bigger fire was not enough. Three things had to work together. First, a vessel that could withstand the inferno without falling apart, the clay crucible. Second, a fuel that burned extremely hot, high-quality charcoal. And third, the most important, a great deal of air blown inside without pause by bellows. It is the same idea as blowing on an ember until it turns almost white, only multiplied by 1,000 and sustained for hours. Inside the sealed crucible, iron and carbon bonded in the exact proportion, and that perfect steel was born. The blacksmith who worked this metal walked a very fine line. Heated too much, and the carbon burned away, turning the blade to glass that shattered at the first strike. Heated too little, and the metal would not even fuse properly. And he controlled all of this without a single modern instrument, only the color of the metal and the sound of the fire. It was an extraordinary knowledge held in the memory and in the hands of very few people, a knowledge written down in no book at all. And a knowledge that lives only inside people is also a knowledge that can die with them. And that is exactly what happened. All of that magic depended on two fragile things. The trade route had to stay open, carrying the metal in from the east, and the few masters who knew how to work it had to stay alive and keep teaching. Around the year 1000, wars and conflicts slowly shut down the routes that linked the north to Asia. The source of the metal dried up, and without the right raw material, not even the finest blacksmith in the world could work miracles. A generation of masters died, and the secret was buried right along with them. Europe, which for one brief moment had held a steel 1,000 years ahead of its time, simply forgot how to make it. Centuries later, in our own era, a master blacksmith decided to take on the impossible, to recreate an Ulfberht sword exactly the way the Vikings would have made it, with no modern shortcuts. And guess what the hardest part turned out to be? The heat, precisely. Keeping a primitive forge stable, hot enough to melt iron, is enough to drive anyone mad. Every attempt was a gamble that could throw hours of work away. But when a blade finally emerged, the test began. It bent, withstood the impact, and cut like the originals, hard and flexible at the same time. That experiment proved something important. The Vikings didn't use magic, nor any technology impossible to explain. They had something far more impressive than that. Real human knowledge, pushed to the absolute limit of what was possible in that era. The Ulfberht sword is not just an ancient weapon. It is proof that history is not a straight line, always climbing upward. Sometimes humanity takes a brilliant leap forward and then loses the thread and forgets, and has to start over from scratch centuries later. And it is here that this file leaves one final question hanging in the air. If a secret this powerful could be born, shine, and then vanish completely, how many others have already been lost? How many brilliant technologies has humanity discovered, used, and forgotten without leaving a trace? Perhaps the answer lies buried, right now, in some other tomb that has yet to be opened. Leave your theory in the comments about what else may have been lost to time. If this dossier held your attention, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next file. Because the next case we are about to open has a connection to this sword that you will never imagine.